They showed up under the cover of night, badges flashing, voices sharp, demanding answers from the woman inside. The HOA had finally escalated their threats, sending men dressed as police to intimidate her into submission. To the neighbors watching, it looked convincing enough. But behind that door was no ordinary homeowner. She was the county sheriff, a woman sworn to uphold the law, now staring down impostors who had no idea who they were up against. What happens when the enforcers of fear meet the enforcer of justice herself? The Harris family moved into the neighborhood with the same hopes as so many others: a quiet street, safe sidewalks, and a place to finally put down roots. The homes were well kept, the lawns neatly trimmed, and from the outside it looked like the picture of suburban peace. For David Harris, it was a chance to focus on his career and give his wife, Sarah, the stability she deserved. Sarah Harris wasn't just any homeowner. She was the county sheriff. But to her, this neighborhood wasn't about titles or uniforms. It was about walking their dog in the evenings, waving at neighbors, and hosting Sunday barbecues in the backyard. She wanted to be seen not as an officer of the law, but as another friendly face in the community. For a while, it seemed possible. Kids rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac. Families decorated their porches for the holidays. The sound of laughter carried across fences. Yet beneath the surface, something else lingered. A quiet tension everyone knew but few dared to speak about. The HOA, they weren't just enforcing rules. They were enforcing power. The board members had a reputation for nitpicking every detail, from the shade of paint on garage doors to the angle of a parked car. For some, it was an annoyance. For others, it was a nightmare. And at the center of it all stood one board member who seemed to thrive on control: Marjorie, known by many as the self-appointed watchdog of the community. It didn't take long before the Harrises caught her attention. At first, it was subtle: a note about their mailbox being the wrong height, a warning about leaving their garbage cans out too long. Small things, laughable in their pettiness, but written with a sharpness that made it clear. These weren't friendly reminders. They were warnings. David brushed it off, believing it was just a neighbor taking her role too seriously. But Sarah noticed the way Marjorie lingered near their yard during her evening walks, how her gaze fixated on even the smallest details. Sarah had dealt with intimidation before, in far more dangerous situations, but she also knew what it looked like when someone tried to establish dominance. For a while, they played along. They adjusted the mailbox, they pulled in the garbage cans earlier. They kept the peace. But peace in this neighborhood came at a cost, and the HOA wasn't content with small victories. One day, a letter arrived that felt different. It wasn't about mailboxes or garbage cans. It accused the Harrises of violating community codes in a way that sounded absurd, almost fabricated, and it carried a threat. Failure to comply could result in further action. Sarah folded the letter and placed it on the counter. Her expression was calm, but her instincts told her this wasn't just another petty complaint. It was the beginning of something bigger, and she was right. Because when intimidation didn't work, the HOA would reach for a new tactic, one that crossed a line so boldly it would shatter the illusion of control they thought they had. The first wave of notices came quickly. According to the HOA, the Harrises' porch light was too bright. Their lawn edging was improper, and Sarah's patrol vehicle, parked discreetly in their driveway on nights she was on call, was an eyesore in violation of community rules. At first, David tried to laugh it off. Who could possibly care about the wattage of a porch light? But the letters kept coming, each one written in stiff, threatening language, stamped with the HOA's seal of authority. Every word felt less like a reminder and more like a summons. Neighbors began whispering. Some had received the same treatment before, driven to repaint homes, move long-standing fences, even remove beloved gardens. The HOA thrived on fear, and for reasons no one could quite explain, Sarah and David had become their newest target. Sarah wasn't easily rattled. She had faced criminals, interrogations, and dangerous standoffs in her career, but she wasn't blind to what was happening. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. The fines followed next. A bill slid into their mailbox claiming they owed hundreds of dollars for repeated infractions. The so-called violations were absurd. Grass growing unevenly, A holiday wreath left up beyond the designated period, even a safety complaint that someone had seen Sarah's service vehicle and felt intimidated. The message was clear. The board wanted them gone, and if they wouldn't leave, they would be punished until they broke. But Sarah wasn't the type to break. She started documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every late-night photo Marjorie took from across the street. The file grew thick, but the harassment didn't stop. In fact, it escalated. Anonymous calls came late at night. The phone would ring, and when David answered, there was only silence on the other end. One evening, their dog barked frantically at the back fence, and when Sarah rushed outside, she saw a figure slipping into the shadows. It was intimidation in its purest form, and then came the sticker. A bright orange violation notice plastered across their front door for the whole neighborhood to see. "Out of compliance!" screamed across the paper in bold black letters. Neighbors slowed their walks to glance, shaking their heads, whispering. Sarah peeled it off with steady hands, but the message was clear. This was no longer a quiet dispute. It was public humiliation. David was furious, ready to confront the board directly, but Sarah stopped him. "Not yet," she told him. She knew better than anyone that sometimes the best response was patience and evidence. Still, even patience has limits. The final escalation came with a letter unlike any before. Failure to comply may result in law enforcement intervention, it read. David nearly tore it in half out of rage. HOAs didn't control the police. They couldn't send officers to drag someone out of their own home over porch lights and wreaths. But Sarah noticed the wording. It wasn't written like a bluff. It was written like a promise, and just a few nights later, that promise came knocking. Hard, deliberate fists pounded on the door. Flashing badges pressed against the glass, voices shouting for Sarah to come outside. From the street, it looked official. Uniforms, belts, even holstered weapons. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, convinced this was a real arrest, but Sarah saw it instantly. The cars parked outside had no department markings. The badges were shiny but cheap, their emblems just slightly off. Their uniforms didn't match. These weren't officers. They were impostors, sent by the HOA to intimidate her into obedience. What they didn't realize was who they had just tried to threaten. And in that moment, Sarah Harris, the county sheriff, stepped forward, not as a victim, but as the one person who could turn this entire situation on its head. The pounding on the front door rattled through the house. David froze, but Sarah stood steady, her eyes locked on the impostors outside. Their voices were commanding, their fake badges pressed against the glass as they shouted for her to step out. To anyone else, it might have looked real. To Sarah, it was laughable. Sloppy uniforms, no unit numbers, and cheap nylon belts that no real deputy would wear. She opened the door just a crack, enough for the porch light to spill across her calm but unyielding face. The men straightened, trying to look intimidating. "Step outside," one barked. Sarah's voice was steady, almost cold. "Which department are you with?" The impostors exchanged a quick glance. No answer. "Badge numbers?" She pressed. Silence again. Neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the flashing lights and shouting. The phones were up recording. The HOA had planned this as a spectacle. Sarah humiliated in front of the community. But what was about to happen would flip their plan on its head. With deliberate calm, Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out her real badge. Heavy, gleaming, unmistakable. She held it high under the porch light. "You want law enforcement?" she said, her voice cutting through the night. "Here it is. I'm the county sheriff." The impostors froze, their faces drained of color. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the cul-de-sac. One man tried to stammer an excuse, but his words collapsed under the weight of truth. Sarah stepped forward, her authority radiating. "You are impersonating law enforcement," she declared, her voice carrying for every neighbor to hear. "That's a felony." And then, with swift precision, she called it in. Within minutes, real squad cars tore into the neighborhood, red and blue lights reflecting off every window. The impostors were forced to drop their fake weapons and were cuffed on the very street they thought they controlled. Neighbors filmed every second. The spectacle the HOA had wanted had turned into their worst nightmare: exposure. From the crowd, Marjorie, the smug board member who had orchestrated so much of the harassment, tried to slink back into the shadows. But Sarah's gaze found her. Their eyes met, and in that look, Marjorie knew the game was over. The impostors were shoved into the back of squad cars, their fake uniforms torn and pitiful under the flashing lights. The neighborhood buzzed with disbelief, whispers of, "Did that really just happen? And she's the sheriff?" filling the air. David stood at Sarah's side, pride etched across his face, while the neighbors who had once feared HOA retaliation now looked at her with awe. The illusion of the HOA's power had shattered, but this wasn't just about one arrest, or even one night. Because the fallout from this would ripple far beyond their quiet street, and Sarah Harris, the woman they thought they could intimidate, was just getting started. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Word of what happened spread faster than the flashing lights had faded. Videos recorded by neighbors were already circulating online, showing the moment Sarah Harris held up her badge and exposed the fake cops. The comments poured in: shock, outrage, admiration. Overnight, the HOA's power was not only broken, it was humiliated on a public stage. The impostors faced immediate charges for impersonating law enforcement, a felony that carried serious penalties. But the question on everyone's mind was bigger. Who sent them? The trail pointed directly back to the HOA board. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was conspiracy, intimidation, and criminal behavior. Investigators descended on the HOA office. Records were seized. Emails and text messages revealed that Marjorie, the board's so-called watchdog, had spearheaded the plan, enlisting people she thought could scare Sarah into submission. She hadn't counted on her victim being the very person tasked with upholding the law. Marjorie and several board members were charged with conspiracy and reckless endangerment. The sight of them walking out of the HOA office in handcuffs, just weeks after they'd tried to stage Sarah's humiliation, was poetic justice. Neighbors who had once whispered complaints in private now stood together openly, demanding new leadership. The HOA collapsed under scrutiny. Fines were refunded, rules were rewritten, and new elections were held. For the first time, the community wasn't led by fear, but by people who genuinely cared about fairness and unity. The oppressive silence that once hung over the neighborhood gave way to laughter, cookouts, and porch conversations without the fear of Marjorie's clipboard lurking nearby. For Sarah and David, the victory wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming peace. The home they'd chosen for its promise of safety and normalcy was finally what they'd dreamed of, a sanctuary. But their story had become something larger. Local news covered it, then national outlets picked it up. The sheriff who exposed fake cops sent by an HOA, it was the kind of headline that captured attention everywhere. And it sparked a much bigger conversation about the unchecked power some associations wield. Sarah, who had never sought the spotlight, found herself at its center. And though she didn't relish the attention, she understood the importance. Her story wasn't just her own, it was a warning. A reminder that no one, not even an HOA board, is above the law. The neighbors never looked at her the same way again, not just as the woman who waved from her porch, but as the person who stood firm when the pressure grew unbearable. Someone who had shown that intimidation only works when you let it. The HOA's reign of fear was over. In its place stood a stronger community, bonded not by rules but by resilience. And as Sarah looked out over her street in the weeks that followed, she knew the truth. Sometimes the fight for your home is also the fight for your dignity, because a house is just wood and nails. But a home, your home, should never be a place where you feel powerless. So I'll leave you with this question. If your HOA pushed you to the edge, threatening your peace and your family, would you have the courage to push back, no matter the cost?